remember the exact moment everything fell apart. It wasn't a scream or a fight or even something dramatic. It was one sentence, 7 letters, 2 words. Man up. I didn't mean it the way it came out, and honestly, I wasn't even thinking about the weight of those words when I said them. I was thinking about how everyone was looking at me, waiting for a joke or some witty comment. I was thinking about how he was sitting there, silent and slouched, like he didn't even want to be there, and it frustrated me. I thought about the fact that we hadn't even really spoken all week, beyond the shallow exchanges about groceries and schedules, and the last thing I wanted was for everyone to notice that gap between us. So I made the joke. I smiled when I said it, laughed a little even to soften it. Man up, I said, nudging him like it was playful, like it wasn't a sharp little blade I was trying to wedge between us to make him react. The room went quiet, but only for a second. People laughed nervously, maybe because they thought I meant it as a joke. Maybe they just didn't know what else to do. My husband, though, he didn't laugh. He didn't even flinch. He just looked at me with this expression I couldn't place, this mix of hurt and something heavier, something darker. And then he smiled. Not the kind of smile I was used to, not the kind that ever reached his eyes. It was tight, forced, almost mechanical. He said nothing. Just picked up his drink, took a sip, and stared straight ahead like I wasn't even there. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I'd said worse before, hadn't I? We both had. That's what happens in long relationships. You say things you don't mean. You push buttons. You figure out where the lines are, and sometimes you cross them. I thought he'd just shrug it off like he usually did, like we always did. But when the night ended and everyone had gone home, he didn't look at me. He didn't touch me. He didn't say goodnight. He just climbed into bed, rolled to his side, and shut the world out, including me. The silence wasn't unusual, not really. We'd been doing this dance for months now, maybe years. It's not like you notice the exact moment you stop holding hands or stop saying, I love you before bed. Those things fade gradually, quietly, like water wearing down stone. But this silence felt different. It wasn't just empty. It was heavy, suffocating. And the worst part, I knew I'd put it there. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it didn't matter. I didn't do anything wrong, I told myself. He was overreacting. He always overreacted to stuff like this. It was his problem, not mine. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small, nagging voice whispered that I'd crossed a line this time. A line I didn't even know was there. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the shower running. He always woke up earlier than me, even on weekends. It used to annoy me, how he couldn't just stay in bed, couldn't let the morning stretch out into something slow and soft like it used to when we first got married. Now, though, I missed it. I missed the mornings when we'd laugh under the covers, whispering about nothing before the world got to us. I stayed in bed, listening to the water, wondering if he'd come back to the room and say something, anything, when he was done. But when the water stopped, all I heard was the soft opening and closing of drawers, the creak of the closet door, and then the front door shutting behind him. No goodbye, no note, just silence. I told myself not to care. He was probably just running an errand or blowing off steam. He'd be back. He always came back. But as the hours stretched on and the sun crawled higher in the sky, I started to feel that familiar knot in my stomach tighten. I busied myself with meaningless tasks, tidying up the kitchen, folding laundry that didn't need folding, scrolling through my phone without really looking at anything. Anything to avoid sitting with the quiet. By noon, I was pacing. I thought about texting him but stopped myself. What would I even say? Where are you? Are you okay? I didn't mean it. I hated how needy it sounded, how desperate. So instead, I did what I always did when I didn't know how to deal with him. I called my best friend, Emily. Emily was one of the few people I could still be real with. She'd known me since college, back when I was carefree and fun, back before the weight of everything. The marriage, the house, the expectations settled on my shoulders. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that immediately made me feel worse. "What's up?" she asked. I could hear the clatter of dishes in the background, the sound of her kids laughing. She always sounded like she was juggling a million things but still had time for me, and I hated that I needed her so much. "I think I messed up," I said, sitting down on the couch and curling my legs under me. She didn't miss a beat. "What happened?" I told her everything, about the dinner, the comment, the way he'd looked at me. As I talked, the words started to tumble out faster and faster, like I was trying to outrun the guilt that had been chasing me all morning. By the time I finished, I was out of breath, my hands shaking. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could feel my heart pounding in the silence. Finally, Emily sighed. "Look, I'm not saying you're wrong to be frustrated, but you said that in front of people. You know how he is about that stuff." I bristled at her tone, defensive and ashamed all at once. "I didn't mean it the way it came out," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "It was a joke. Everyone laughed." "Did he?" she asked, and her voice was so soft, so careful that it cut me more than if she'd yelled. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. "He'll come around," she said after a moment, her tone lighter, like she was trying to steer me away from the edge. "He just needs some time. You know how guys are." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and tried to believe her. But as the afternoon turned to evening and there was still no sign of him, that knot in my stomach twisted tighter. When he finally walked through the door, it was dark out. He didn't say a word as he set his keys on the counter and walked past me into the bedroom. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey," I said, my voice softer than I expected. He didn't look at me. "I'm tired," he said, pulling off his shoes and setting them neatly by the door. "Can we talk?" He sighed, not annoyed exactly, but something close to it. "I don't want to do this right now. That should have been enough. I should have let it go, given him the space he clearly needed. But I couldn't." The silence between us felt like a living thing, something that was growing stronger and bigger every second we let it. "What's going on with you?" I asked, my voice sharper this time. "You've been acting weird all week, and now this. You can't just shut me out like this." He turned to me then, his expression unreadable. "Do you even hear yourself?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with something icy, something unfamiliar. "You humiliated me in front of our friends, and now you're mad because I'm not giving you what you want." His words hit me like a slap, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "I didn't humiliate you," I said, my voice trembling. "It was a joke. I didn't mean it." He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You never mean it, do you?" And with that, he turned away, leaving me standing there in the dark, my own words echoing in my head. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, dissecting every word, every inflection, every look. "You never mean it, do you?" His voice was calm when he said it, but it hit like a brick. It wasn't just about what I said that night. It was everything. Every offhand remark, every argument where I let my frustration get the better of me, every time I let my pride win over kindness. And now, the weight of it all was settling on my chest, making it hard to breathe. By the time the sun came up, I had convinced myself that I needed to fix this, that I just had to find the right words to make him understand. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I came out, staring down at a cup of coffee like it might tell him what to do. He looked so tired, so worn down, and for a moment, all I wanted to do was wrap my arms around him and tell him I was sorry. But I hesitated, and the moment passed. "Can we talk?" I asked, hovering in the doorway like I wasn't sure if I was allowed to step inside. He didn't look up. "I don't know what else there is to say." "There's a lot to say," I said, my voice shaking. I took a step forward, gripping the back of a chair like it was the only thing keeping me steady. "I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I really am." I wasn't thinking. I was frustrated, and it came out wrong, but you have to know that I didn't mean it the way it sounded. He finally looked at me then, his eyes tired and guarded. "It's not just about what you said. It's not about that one comment." "Then what is it?" I asked, desperate now. "Because I feel like I'm fighting for something and I don't even know what I'm up against." He shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. "That's the problem. You don't see it. You don't see how the little things add up, how they chip away at me until there's nothing left." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him that he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. I thought about all the times I'd snapped at him over something small, all the times I'd let my frustration boil over into sarcasm or silence. I thought about how easy it was to blame him for everything that was wrong in our marriage without ever stopping to look at myself. "I didn't mean to," I started, but he cut me off. "I know you didn't," he said, his voice soft but firm. But that doesn't make it any easier to live with. The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I wanted to tell him that I could change, that I could do better, that I could be the person he needed me to be. but the look in his eyes told me that he didn't believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I believed me either. He stood up then, grabbing his keys off the counter. "I need some space," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I'll be back later." I wanted to stop him to tell him that space wasn't the answer, that running away wouldn't solve anything, but I didn't. I just stood there, gripping the back of the chair, watching as he walked out the door. The silence in the house was deafening after he left. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything other than the gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. But no matter what I did, my mind kept drifting back to him, to the look on his face when he said he needed space. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something deeper, something final. By the time he came home that evening, I'd worked myself into a state of quiet desperation. I was ready to beg if I had to, ready to do whatever it took to fix this. But when he walked through the door, he wasn't alone. He was holding a stack of papers, thick and crisp and official-looking. He set them down on the counter without a word, his face unreadable. My heart dropped as I stared at them, and it took me a moment to realize what they were. Divorce papers. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My knees went weak, and I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep myself upright. "What is this?" I managed to choke out, though I already knew. "It's what you wanted," he said quietly. "Isn't it? What I wanted," I repeated, my voice rising. "How could you think that? I don't want this. I don't want any of this." He looked at me then, and for the first time I saw tears in his eyes. "I don't think you even know what you want," he said, his voice breaking. "But I know what I can't do anymore. I can't keep trying to prove myself to someone who only sees what I'm not." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the tears streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. I wanted to scream, to argue, to tell him that he was wrong, but I couldn't, because deep down I knew he wasn't. I stared at the papers on the counter, my vision blurring as the tears kept coming. My hands trembled as I reached out, barely brushing the edge of the stack with my fingertips as if touching them would make it all real. "You can't mean this," I whispered, my voice breaking. "This can't be what you want," he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Do you think this is easy for me, that I woke up one day and decided to give up on us?" His voice wasn't angry, but the exhaustion in it cut deeper than any rage could. I've tried so hard, but every time I think we're making progress, it's like you find a new way to remind me that I'll never be enough for you." "That's not true," I shouted, my voice desperate, cracking under the weight of my emotions. "You are enough. I don't want this. I don't want any of this." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a sadness so profound that it took my breath away. "Then why does it feel like you've been pushing me away for years?" His words felt like a mirror, one I'd been avoiding for far too long. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that I wasn't the problem, that he was the one who always shut down, who walked away. But as I stood there, staring into the depths of his hurt, I realized how much of this I'd refused to see. The memories came rushing back, uninvited and unrelenting. The times I'd dismissed his feelings because I was too wrapped up in my own. The moments I'd let my frustration spill out in cruel, cutting words because it was easier than admitting I felt vulnerable. The nights I'd laid beside him, pretending to be asleep, too afraid to reach out because I didn't know how to fix what was broken. "I didn't mean to push you away," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even realize I was doing it. I thought we were fine." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You thought ignoring the cracks would make them disappear, but they didn't. They just got bigger." I wanted to argue, to plead, to promise him that I could change, but the words caught in my throat. Because the truth was, I didn't know if I could. I didn't know if I even knew how to love him the way he needed me to anymore. He picked up the papers and held them out to me, his hand steady even as mine shook. "This doesn't have to be final," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "I'm not filing them yet, but I need you to understand how serious this is. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep waiting for you to see me." I didn't take the papers. I couldn't. My hands stayed frozen at my sides, fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. "You're giving up on us," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "No," he said firmly, his eyes locking onto mine. "I'm giving us a chance to stop pretending, to figure out if we can even fix this." The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to do anything that would break the unbearable tension. But all I could do was stand there, tears streaming down my face as he walked past me and out the door. The sound of his car pulling out of the driveway echoed in my ears long after he was gone. I sank onto the floor, my back against the counter, staring blankly at the space where he'd been. The papers sat on the counter above me, an unspoken ultimatum I wasn't ready to face. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. Time felt meaningless as I sat there, trying to make sense of the pieces of my life that were slipping through my fingers. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who laughed freely, who believed in happy endings, who looked at him like he was her whole world. I didn't know where she'd gone, but I missed her, and I missed him, the man who used to hold me like I was something precious, who used to make me feel like I was enough. For the first time, I wondered if he felt the same way. If he missed the version of me I used to be as much as I missed the version of him he used to be. And if we'd both been holding on to the ghosts of who we were instead of seeing each other for who we'd become. The thought was too much to bear, so I pushed it aside and reached for my phone. My hands shook as I dialed Emily's number. She picked up after a few rings, her voice warm and familiar. "I need help," I said, my voice breaking. "What's going on?" she asked, concern lacing her tone. I took a deep, shuddering breath, my eyes drifting back to the papers on the counter. "I think I'm losing him," I whispered, "and I don't know what to do." Emily didn't respond right away. I could hear the faint hum of her breathing, steady and deliberate, as if she was trying to choose her words carefully. Finally, she said, "Okay, start from the beginning. What happened?" I stared at the divorce papers, feeling the weight of them even from across the room. "He left these on the counter," I said, my voice trembling. "Divorce papers." He said he hasn't filed them yet, but I think he's serious. I think this might really be the end. Her sharp intake of breath came through the line, and I imagined her sitting up straighter, her concern palpable even through the phone. "Did you talk to him? Did he say why?" "It's everything," I said, my words coming out in a rush. "The little things I've said, the way I've acted. He says I've been pushing him away for years, and maybe I have, but I didn't even realize it. I thought we were okay, you know? I thought this was just marriage." Emily's voice softened. "Marriage is hard, but it's not supposed to feel like this. You've both been hurting for a while, haven't you?" The truth of her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I swallowed hard against the lump rising in my throat. I think I've been so focused on what I thought he wasn't doing that I didn't see what I wasn't doing. And now, I don't know if it's too late to fix it. "It's not too late," she said firmly, her tone cutting through my despair like a lifeline. "But you have to figure out what you want and be honest about it, not just with him, with yourself." I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the counter. "I want him," I whispered. "I want us, but I don't know how to get back to that." "You start by owning your part," she said, "and then you fight for him, for both of you. But you have to really mean it, not just say the words because you're scared of losing him. He'll know the difference." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the papers, running through every memory, every fight, every moment that had brought us to this point. I thought about the good times, too. The nights we stayed up talking until dawn, the way he used to make me laugh until my sides hurt, the way he looked at me on our wedding day like I was the only thing that mattered in the world. I realized then that I'd spent so much time resenting him for not being the man he used to be that I hadn't stopped to think about the woman I'd become. I used to be warm, open, full of love and hope. Somewhere along the way, I'd turned cold, defensive, more focused on winning arguments than preserving what we had. The thought made my chest ache, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself cry, not out of anger or frustration, but out of grief for the pieces of us that I'd let slip through my fingers. When the tears finally stopped, I felt hollowed out, like I'd poured everything I had left onto the floor around me. But there was a strange sense of clarity in that emptiness, a tiny flicker of resolve that hadn't been there before. I stood up, brushing off my legs, and grabbed the papers from the counter. I flipped through them, my heart pounding as I skimmed the words that could unravel everything we'd built together. And then I stopped, my eyes landing on the blank line where my signature would go. I set the papers down and grabbed my keys, my hands steady for the first time all day. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but I knew I couldn't let this end without trying, really trying. The drive to his office felt like it took an eternity, and by the time I parked, my hands were shaking again. I sat there for a moment, staring at the entrance, willing myself to move. Finally, I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, my heart racing with every step I took toward the building. When I reached his door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What if he didn't want to see me? What if I'd already lost him? The thought made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to knock anyway. "Come in," his voice called from the other side, and I pushed the door open, my breath catching when I saw him sitting at his desk. He looked up, his expression guarded but not unkind. "I wasn't expecting you," he said, his voice even. "I know," I said, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. My hands clutched the divorce papers like they were my anchor, and I held them out to him. "I'm not signing these, not yet." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching mine. "Why not?" "Because I'm not ready to give up," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've messed up more times than I can count, but I want to fix this. I don't know how yet, but I'm willing to try if you are." He didn't say anything right away, and the silence stretched between us, heavy and uncertain. Finally, he let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging as if the weight he'd been carrying was finally catching up to him. "I don't know if I can do this again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His words cut through me, but I stepped closer, holding his gaze. "I'm asking you to try just one more time, please." For a moment he didn't move, didn't speak, and then slowly he nodded, the tiniest flicker of hope in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. I sat in the quiet of my car after leaving his office, the weight of his tentative agreement still sinking in. It wasn't a resolution, not even close, but it felt like the first breath after being underwater for too long. The drive home was a blur, the streetlights streaking past as my mind churned through 1,000 thoughts at once. Back at the house, the silence greeted me like an old friend, heavy and familiar. It was the kind of quiet I'd learned to live with, the absence of laughter, of conversation of us. I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the empty living room, and felt the weight of what I was fighting for. This wasn't just about saving a marriage. It was about saving the version of me that still believed in love, in connection, in the possibility of something better. I spent the next few days walking a tightrope of emotions, trying to figure out what came next. He didn't call, and I didn't reach out either, afraid of pushing too hard, too fast. Instead, I threw myself into reflection, replaying every argument, every misstep, every moment where I could have chosen kindness over criticism, understanding over defensiveness. One night, I found myself sitting on the edge of our bed, holding an old photo album I'd pulled from the closet. The pictures inside felt like relics from another life, smiling faces, arms wrapped around each other, eyes full of love and hope. There was one photo in particular that stopped me cold. The two of us at the beach, his arm draped over my shoulder as I leaned into him, both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember anymore. I traced the edges of the photo with my fingertips, tears spilling onto the page. "Where did we go?" I whispered into the empty room. The silence offered no answers, only the echo of my own question. By the time he called, 3 days had passed since our conversation in his office. I was in the kitchen, staring at the clock on the microwave when my phone buzzed on the counter. His name lit up the screen and my heart jumped into my throat. "Hello," I answered, my voice unsteady. "Hey," he said, and there was a pause that felt like it stretched on forever. "I was wondering if we could talk." "Of course," I said quickly, my breath catching. "When?" "Tonight," he said. "I'll come over after work." When the call ended, I set the phone down and stared at it, my mind racing. Tonight. This was it, my chance to show him that I was willing to fight for us, that I was ready to own my mistakes and do whatever it took to make things right. The hours leading up to his arrival felt agonizingly slow. I paced the living room, rehearsing what I wanted to say, only to second-guess myself at every turn. By the time his car pulled into the driveway, my nerves were so frayed that I felt like I might shatter. He stepped inside, his presence filling the room in a way that both comforted and unsettled me. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, his face lined with an exhaustion that seemed deeper than physical. "Thanks for coming," I said, my voice soft. He nodded, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I wasn't sure if I should." The honesty in his words stung, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I'm glad you did," I said, gesturing toward the couch. "Can we sit?" We sat down, the space between us feeling like an ocean. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching taut. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About how I've pushed you away." His eyes flicked to mine, wary but listening. "You're right," I continued, my voice trembling. I didn't mean to, but I did. I think I was so focused on what I thought you weren't giving me that I didn't see what I wasn't giving you, and I'm sorry for that." He didn't respond right away, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I'm not blameless either. I should have said something sooner. I should have fought harder instead of shutting down." The honesty in his words was like a balm to the raw edges of my heart, and I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I need to try." For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and I braced myself for the worst. But then he reached out, his hand covering mine, and I felt the smallest flicker of warmth spread through me. "Me too," he said quietly. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was enough to remind me that we still had something worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The days that followed were careful, almost delicate. It was as if we were tiptoeing through a minefield, unsure of where the explosions might still be buried. Conversations were short and careful, filled with pauses and unspoken words, but they were happening. And that was more than we'd had in months, maybe years. He started coming home earlier, even if it meant sitting in silence with the television on while I folded laundry or pretended to read. I tried cooking dinner instead of ordering takeout, not because I thought it would fix anything, but because it felt like an act of care, a reminder of the person I wanted to be again. One night, after we'd both finished eating in near silence, I set down my fork and looked at him. "Do you remember the trip we took to the cabin a few years ago?" He glanced up, surprised, and nodded. "Yeah, the one where it rained the whole time." I smiled, the memory tugging at the edges of my heart. "And we stayed inside playing board games and drinking wine until we fell asleep on the couch." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "You cheated at Scrabble." "I did not," I protested, a laugh bubbling up before I could stop it. "You just didn't believe quixotic was a real word." "It still sounds made up," he muttered, but there was warmth in his tone, a softness I hadn't heard in a long time. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tension between us eased, if only for a moment. I clung to it, desperate to keep the fragile connection alive. The next day, I found myself looking through old photo albums again, searching for reminders of who we used to be. One picture caught my attention. The two of us standing in front of that cabin, his arm around my waist, my face tilted up toward his, both of us laughing like we didn't have a care in the world. I pulled the photo out of the album and tucked it into my bag, an idea forming in the back of my mind. That evening, as he walked through the door, I met him with a nervous smile. "Can we talk?" His brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Sure." I hesitated, my hands twisting together. I was thinking, what if we went back to the cabin, just for a weekend, no distractions, no phones, just us? He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You think a weekend away is going to fix everything?" "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "I don't think anything will fix this overnight. But I think we need time. Time to remember who we are together without all the noise and stress and everything else." He didn't respond right away, and I braced myself for rejection. But then he sighed and said, "Okay, let's do it." His agreement felt like a victory, small but significant. Over the next few days, I threw myself into planning the trip, packing carefully and even pulling out the old board games we'd played last time. I didn't want to hope too much, but I couldn't help the flicker of excitement that grew with each passing day. When the weekend arrived, the drive to the cabin was quiet but not uncomfortable. The radio played softly in the background, and I caught him humming along to a song we used to love. It was such a small thing, but it made my chest ache with longing for the man I used to know, the man I still hoped was in there somewhere. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it, nestled in the woods like a secret waiting to be rediscovered. As we unloaded the car, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and trepidation, like stepping into a memory and hoping it still fit. That first night, we sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow over the room. I opened a bottle of wine, and he set up one of the old board games, his movements slower, more deliberate than I remembered. As we played, the conversation started to flow, hesitant at first but gradually gaining momentum. We laughed about old memories, teased each other about who was winning, and for a little while it felt like we'd stepped back in time. But as the night wore on, the laughter faded, replaced by a heavier silence. He stared at the game board, his hands resting on his knees, and I knew he was working up to something. "I don't know if I can ever forget some of the things you said," he admitted finally, his voice low. "They're just there in the back of my mind, no matter how much I want to move past them." His words felt like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I know," I said softly. "And I don't expect you to forget. I just want the chance to show you that I'm not that person anymore, or at least that I'm trying not to be." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "I want to believe you," he said, "but I'm scared that we'll fall back into the same patterns, that nothing will really change." I reached across the table, my hand covering his. "I'm scared too," I admitted. "But I'm here, I'm trying, and I hope that's enough for now." For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he gave a small nod, his fingers tightening around mine. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was a start, and for now that was enough. The next few days at the cabin were a mix of awkward silences and quiet moments of connection, like we were both testing the waters of a relationship we had almost forgotten how to navigate. There were moments when I thought we were finally finding our way back to something real. Simple things like cooking breakfast together, or him brushing a stray strand of hair from my face when we sat close on the couch. But every time I allowed myself to feel too hopeful, the weight of everything we had to fix would settle on my chest again, and I'd remember how much work it would take to truly heal what was broken between us. On the fourth day, I woke up to the sound of him standing by the window, staring out at the rain, his posture rigid. The storm had come out of nowhere, swirling in the trees like an omen. The cabin felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in, reminding me of the distance that still lay between us. I got up and walked over to him, standing beside him by the window, my arms crossed over my chest. "Is everything okay?" I asked quietly. He didn't immediately respond, and I waited, watching the rain blur the world outside. Finally, he turned to face me, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't read. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he said slowly. "And I'm not sure if we can go back to what we were. I don't know if I can forgive you for everything. Some of it just hurt too much." His words hit me harder than I expected, even though I'd known this conversation was coming. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but the lump in my throat felt like it might choke me. "I know," I whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away or maybe ever. I need you to know I'm not that person anymore. I'm sorry. I've been so selfish, so focused on what I needed from you that I didn't even see how much I was hurting you." He sighed, turning back to the window. "I think part of me is still angry," he admitted. "Not just about what you said, but about everything, the way we let things fall apart. It feels like we were both too afraid to deal with the hard stuff, and now we're just standing in the wreckage." I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but everything I said felt inadequate. "I know it's hard. I know it might not be enough, but I want to try. I want to fight for this, fight for us." There was a long pause, and when he finally turned to face me again, his expression had softened, but the weight of what we'd been through still lingered between us. "I want to believe you," he said quietly, "but I don't know if I can." I nodded, my heart sinking. "I understand." For a long time, we stood there in silence, the storm outside continuing to rage. I wanted so badly for things to be different, for us to be different, but I knew that no matter how hard I tried, there were no easy answers, no guarantees. Just this fragile hope that maybe somehow we could still find a way back to each other. But for the first time since we'd arrived, I felt a glimmer of something real between us. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't fixed, but it was something. And that, at least, was a start. The rest of the day passed in a quiet haze, both of us lost in our thoughts. We cooked together, avoided the deeper conversations that still haunted us, and when the evening came, we sat outside on the porch, watching the rain slowly taper off. The air was thick and fresh, filled with the scent of earth and wet wood. I felt the smallest flicker of peace settle over me, a sense of calm that hadn't been there in months. "I think I need some time," he said, breaking the silence as we watched the rain stop and the clouds begin to break apart. "I understand," I said softly. "I'm just not sure if we're ready for what comes next." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words in the pit of my stomach. We were both still treading water, unsure of whether we could stay afloat or whether we were both just too tired to keep fighting. "I think we need to stop pretending," I said, my voice low. "Stop pretending that we can just fix everything in one weekend or with a few conversations. We have to be real about the mess we're in, or it's never going to get better." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "You're right, I just don't know if we can get through it." I swallowed hard, my fingers clenching around the edge of my seat. "Neither do I whispered. "But I'm not ready to give up. Not yet." We sat there for a while, neither of us saying anything. It wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was honest. And sometimes, in a marriage that had lost its way, honesty felt like the only thing left that mattered. When we finally went to bed that night, the room felt quieter than it ever had before, as if we were both holding our breath, waiting for something, anything, to shift. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing, wondering if we could truly find our way back to each other. But the question remained, could we? Could we ever really move past the hurt, the years of resentment and frustration? Or was the damage too deep, too permanent to fix? And if the answer was no, if we couldn't find our way back, what then? What would I be left with? What would we both be left with? I didn't know, I didn't have the answers. But as I lay in the darkness, listening to the steady rise and fall of his breathing beside me, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. The next few weeks felt like a strange kind of purgatory, caught between the life we had before and the one we were trying to rebuild. We went through the motions. Dinners at the table, shared glances across rooms, the mundane tasks of life. But it felt hollow, like we were actors playing parts in a story we no longer believed in. I found myself retreating inward, unable to stop replaying everything I'd said, everything I'd done, and wondering if the damage was beyond repair. The weight of those divorce papers still loomed over me like a shadow, a constant reminder of how close we had come to the end. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me, about how I had let my anger and frustration eclipse everything good we had built together. And yet, there was still something there, something that refused to let go. When I looked at him, I saw glimpses of the man I had fallen in love with, the one who laughed with me until our sides hurt, the one who made me feel safe even when everything else seemed out of control. But those moments were fleeting, like wisps of smoke, disappearing before I could grasp them. One evening after dinner, we were sitting on the couch, both of us too tired to speak but too restless to be alone with our thoughts. He reached over and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine, and for a moment it felt like we had found our way back to something real. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Maybe we should see a therapist, together, to figure out how to fix what's broken between us." I didn't answer immediately. The idea of therapy had always seemed like an admission of failure, a sign that we couldn't do it on our own. But now, sitting there with his hand in mine, I knew that maybe we couldn't do it alone anymore. We had reached a point where silence and unspoken feelings weren't going to be enough. "I think that's a good idea," I said finally, my voice shaky with the uncertainty of what it meant. "I think we need to do whatever it takes." He nodded, squeezing my hand tighter. "I don't want to give up on us. I don't think I can." His words sent a strange mix of relief and fear through me. Relief, because for the first time in weeks, he was acknowledging that we had a chance, an actual chance, to fix things. And fear, because the path ahead was unclear, filled with questions and doubts I wasn't sure how to answer. The next few days were a blur of scheduling appointments, reading up on what to expect from therapy, and trying to find some semblance of normalcy in the routine of our lives. But even as we took those first steps toward getting help, something in the back of my mind kept asking, will it be enough? Will we ever be able to look at each other and truly see the people we used to be? Or had we already crossed a line from which there was no return? I couldn't answer that question. I didn't know if I ever would. But what I did know was that I wasn't ready to give up on the person I loved, on the life we had built together, no matter how broken it seemed. The first therapy session was awkward, as expected. We sat across from the therapist, who was kind and patient but asked questions that made me uncomfortable, questions I wasn't ready to answer. She asked about the arguments, about the things I had said, the things he had done. It felt like dredging up everything I had tried to bury, and I could feel my chest tightening with each question. But as the session went on, something shifted. We started to talk, not just about the hurt, but about the things that had brought us together in the first place. The things we had forgotten in the chaos of life. The small moments that had once made us feel like we were a team, not just two people coexisting in the same space. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of silence, moments when we both felt like giving up. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when I remembered why I had loved him in the first place, and I could see that spark of something still there in him too. After the session, we sat in the car in the parking lot, both of us quiet, processing the emotions that had been stirred up. Finally, I turned to him, my voice tentative. "Do you think this will work?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he nodded. "I don't know, but I'm willing to try." I didn't have the answer either, but I squeezed his hand, knowing that for now that was enough. We didn't have to know everything. We didn't have to fix everything in one